I was somewhat embarrassed. I was embarrassed by the fact that I was becoming a Jesus freak, and it was the day of the Jesus freak. This is 1976. Calvary Chapel, Riverside was a big famous church at the time. All the Jesus freaks were around.
Ken was
the musician.
Thinking, what will people think if they hear that I'm a Jesus freak? What will they do if they find out that it's true? Hello and welcome to another Sharing is Caring episode of On the Journey with Matt and Ken. I'm Matt Swaim along with my colleague Ken Hensley, and I've been really enjoying hearing a bit of his story in more depth than I've ever heard it before, actually, and the things that led him to the Catholic faith. Just to set the stage for all of this and what you're about to hear, if you've never joined us before, this is an outreach of the Coming Home Network. Visit us at chnetwork.org. We're a network of all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, including former Baptist pastors like Ken, who are sharing what led them or is leading them to take more seriously the claims of the Catholic Church. And if you want to be involved in conversations with people who are in that situation, then please do consider checking out our online community, community.chnetwork.org. And this is a mini retreat that we're doing here as we unpack Ken's story. And if you want to find out more about our retreats, especially if you're a current pastor like Ken once was, and is interested in coming on one of those retreats, it's chnetwork.org/retreats. Ken Hensley, remind us where we left off and where we're going.
Slashing and hacking our way through the story. Let me begin by saying this, Matt. I have never publicly told my story in this at this level of detail in the 25 years that I've been Catholic now. I don't know if you experienced this when you were doing it, but it feels a bit self-indulgent, to go into this.
Yeah, I feel like I was doing too much talking, right?
Yeah, and I feel the same way. And part of me is like, well, maybe it is self-indulgent a little bit, but then again, maybe the story will help people. And so I'm going to go ahead and be self-indulgent. A story that I typically have told in 45 minutes, I'm probably telling in 5 or 6 weeks, this time. So anyway, where do we leave off? Last week, I told the story of how I came to faith in Jesus Christ, and I left it off there. And I'm going to pick up there now and just sort of move forward. And, if we were at the retreat, then at this point, we would be asking the question, so what is it that opened your heart to the idea that Catholicism might have something to say? And I'm kind of hoping I get there in this session, but I'm not sure I will. Okay?
Well, we're going to see what we can do, Ken. As you know, it took me nearly 5 hours of conversation to sort of unpack some of these. I still left out a bunch of stuff, so I'm interested to see what you can include and what you can leave in. Like I say, this is the part that I've actually heard a little bit about. But even last week, I had heard a lot of those things, but there are a lot of those things I hadn't heard. So
okay, and feel free to jump in and throw me on the rack and do whatever you need to do along the way, okay? Okay, so at the time, I was 22 years old when the last part of the story I told last week about coming to faith in Christ occurred. I was 22. And we had gotten our band back together at that time, and we were performing 5 nights a week at a place called the Red Baron. It was at the Riverside Airport. It was a bar in the Riverside Airport. Well, at that time, a young lady whose name is Tina, who would later become my wife, you mentioned yours as well. Tina was working as a waitress at the restaurant upstairs from the bar. And so I'm in there with my band, and we began playing. It was 5 nights a week, 4 hours a night. You know the deal. It was like 9 o'clock till 1 a.m., 5 nights a week. She came down to watch the band. She and I began to talk. We began to date. And I began very, very slowly to reveal to her the things I was thinking about Christianity. See, you got to remember that I was still operating within a system that is my friends and I was somewhat embarrassed. I was embarrassed by the fact that I was becoming a Jesus freak, and it was the day of the Jesus freak. This is 1976. Calvary Chapel, Riverside was a big famous church at the time. All the Jesus freaks were around.
Ken was
the musician.
thinking, what will people think if they hear that I'm a Jesus freak? What will they do if they find out that it's true?
I was embarrassed, and I was afraid to even tell Tina as we were beginning to do things together and go places. So I kind of drove her crazy, because without wanting to come out with it, I started just making allusions to things like, death and eternity and what's it all about, Alfie, and that kind of thing, and was really kind of driving her crazy. But the reality is that she had just suffered the death of her father, tragically and unexpectedly, and she was actually in a place where she was very open to thinking about the huge, big questions. And so as I began to reveal more to her, she was actually really open. And so we began to attend a home Bible study on Tuesday nights that my friend Bob, that I mentioned last week, the fellow, I guess you could say, that led me to the Lord, that he had invited us to. Tina and I began to attend this Tuesday night Bible study. It was led by a gentleman in his home, where he was like working directly from a Greek New Testament and just opening it up and talking about it and examining it and all that. And I would say that Tina and I, in a way, just kind of became Christians together, although my story began a bit before hers. So we're going to this home Bible study on Tuesday nights, and then we were attending this small Bible church on Sunday mornings that the whole gang from Tuesday night went to. All right. And at that church, we had a pastor that was a true expositor of Scripture. He was the first pastor I ever had, and he was one of the best when it came to that. I mean, he preached the book of Acts, I remember, and took 50 or 60 sermons to get through Acts. And I had never read the book of Acts except when I began to read it on my own. And so I still remember how wonderful it was, his sermons on, the various stories in the book of Acts and all that. And anyway, here's where I was, Matt. At this point, 22 years old, a young believer in Christ, and I was on fire. All I know, I didn't know what God was going to do with me. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. All I knew was that everything in my life had changed. I wanted to get out of the nightclub environment. It just started seeming kind of darker and darker to me. And so eventually I quit the band. And all I wanted to do was study the Bible. All I wanted to do was study theology. It's like my music had been my life, and suddenly music wasn't my life. What my life was being a Christian and becoming one, wanting to read and wanting to learn and I started buying books. I started building a little library, started reading and listening to everything I could find.
Do you remember what some of the books were that you gravitated towards? Any of the ones that maybe come to the top of your mind as you were assembling your library of stuff?
Yeah,
your baby Christian library.
Yeah, I have to think hard about it. Because what pops into my mind immediately are the apologetics works. I think because I came from a kind of a non-believing situation, at least as a teenager and young adult, and since my friends weren't Christians, and I had that feeling about it, I think I was kind of an apologist right away. So C.S. Lewis was heavy on the list. Other apologists like Josh McDowell, John Warwick Montgomery, Francis Schaeffer's stuff was coming in there. So a lot of apologetics works. And when it comes to biblical studies, I'm not really sure, except I was studying the Bible and I was listening to tons of sermons. Do you remember such a thing as a cassette tape?
It's vaguely. I remember taping stuff off the radio, right? And so, definitely I remember, because give me some credit. I was an 80s kid.
Yeah, I'm just joking with you, but I found these places where you could rent the sermons of expositors around the country, and you'd send in and you'd pay them a small fee, and they'd send you a box with 20 cassettes in it, and you'd listen to them. And this was my life, really, especially when I quit the band. I remember I was just working on memorizing passages of the Bible, memorizing chapters. I remember at one point I was over 40 chapters of the Bible I'd memorized. And I used to ride my bike down the street, and just like recite Colossians to myself, and then recite Philippians and Ephesians. This is the world I was living in. I knew that I wanted to go to college, and this was a problem. Because as a rock and roll musician, I had started to junior college 3 different times, and just kind of goofing around, and had just withdrawn on a whim. So I had Fs, withdrawals, incompletes. One time I went to college just because my my girlfriend, this is before, my girlfriend wanted me to go to college, and I said, okay, if you'll pick me up, I'll go, because I didn't have a car. And so I went to college with her, and then when she broke up with me, I just quit going. So I had these college transcripts that looked like the roadmap of Tijuana or something like that. It was really a mess. It was bad. Maybe Shanghai. And so I got a job pushing a trash cart around this 3-story department store in Riverside, where I live, where we grew up. And I remember I would just push this trash cart around all day long, and I had passages of the Bible on note cards just stuck in my pocket, and I would just pull it out and go over my verses and walk around all day long just memorizing the Bible. And then after that, I got a job driving a delivery van for a florist. So I would just load all these flowers into this van, and I would drive around town all day long, and I'd listen literally to about 8 hours of sermons every day. Guys, expositors working through Daniel or Elijah or Isaiah or Revelation or Matthew, Mark, or anything like that. It was just a time for several years when I was just learning. And I went back to junior college. Like I said, I had to, because no college in the universe would have accepted me with my transcripts. So I went to junior college, and the Lord, all I can say is the Lord had screwed my head on, and I was beginning to see the world in a correct way. And I did what I needed to do. I went to junior college and I aced it, went through my 2 years of stuff and got out of that. Anyway, about 3 years into my life as a Christian, Tina and I get married, and we're on our way driving east back to Michigan so that I can attend Bible college and finish my undergraduate degree in Bible and theology.
Which
reason it's called Grace Bible College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The only reason I went there is that this is the school my pastor had gone to. And when I said I want to study the Bible, he said, hey, go there. And I was kind of excited about living somewhere else, because Tina and I had grown up in California, and I had spent my whole life in Southern California. And so, I know you live back east, so this may not mean much to you, but living in a place, we went back to Michigan. In fact, our honeymoon was driving across the country to Michigan to start into college. We lived in a little married student apartment. For the first time in my life, we're living in a place that has honest to God electrical storms, big, crazy storms with lightning, which you almost never see in Southern California. So I totally loved it. I used to go out on our patio and sit and play my guitar and just watch an entire storm, just so I could see all the electricity. Seeing a place where leaves actually turn very beautiful colors in the fall. This was all new to me, and I was stunned by it. I remember this little tree that was right out in front of our apartment, and in the fall, that first year, it just turned this red, and it was like this bright, like really bright red, and I just stood there staring at it.
Let me ask you a question about that
Just
tree.
amazed.
Had like a itinerant Jewish preacher come through a couple of days before and told that tree to bear fruit no more? I just want to make sure if that was not.
I don't know, because I don't know if it was a fruit-bearing tree.
I'm
But,
trying to imagine what it would be like to be an adult and see like leaves change for the first time, or in person.
It was really
right?
nice.
I'm sure you saw it on TV, but then you got the Michigan snow too, though, and that's nobody's idea of fun.
Except when it's new to you, it just seemed like magical. It was very beautiful. In fact, those are really good days in a number of ways. We're newlywed. We're living in a new place. I'm seeing the leaves turn these colors. I'm spending my days in class studying the Old Testament, studying the New Testament, classical Greek, church history, all the stuff that I was really in love with. I'm learning about, making new friends. It was a good time. And I like the storms, but one thing I had to learn was that you don't go to bed with your car windows rolled down, even if it looks like the sky is clear and everything's great, I remember just sitting up in bed one night, and it sounded like someone had taken a double-barrel shotgun and just put it right next to my head and just blasted it off, the thunder. And I just jumped up, and I look out, and it was just like pouring. This doesn't happen in Southern California either. And I ran to the door, and I remember I had to push the door open because the wind was blowing. It was like a hurricane gale. And I pushed the door open, and I ran to my car and quickly jumped in and started rolling up all the windows that were down. And by the time I got back to the apartment, it was as though I I mean, I may as well have dove into the ocean and swam for like an hour. I was completely drenched. But anyway, this was a good time in life. And I know some people are thinking, what the heck does this have to do with a story about becoming Catholic? And so again, I apologize. I do feel that is a bit self-indulgent, but it's fun to be able to tell this story in kind of
This is a 4D experience, right? This is, if we had the 4D stuff, like this would be where like vapor spray would be coming out of the monitor on people as you're telling the story.
Yes.
So
it was
the smell of
it was
burnt
a big
popcorn in the dorms, that sort of thing.
Okay, it was a big deal. So I'm making friends at school. My best friend, his name was Otis. He and I throwing frisbees back and forth, doing our studies together. I loved going to Grace Bible College and learning theology and learning the Bible and focusing my whole life on it, although I had no idea what I was going to do with it at that point. Okay, here's something new. During that time, I got a job at a Christian bookstore in town, in Grand Rapids. This was a bookstore that specialized in the works of the great Reformation theologians, as well as the English and American Puritans. Okay? So I began to move deeper because the school I was going to, the church I had gone to, you would call it evangelical. It was modern and it was evangelical. So for the first time in my life now, I'm beginning to read Luther directly. I'm beginning to read Calvin. And I'm reading guys like John Owen, John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, George Whitefield, and then Jonathan Edwards, the great New England Puritan. And whereas my idols, all of my teenage years, my idols had been John Paul, George, and Ringo, essentially, and some others. A little bit the Kinks, Matt, okay? The Kinks get in there a little bit. Now my idols were these great Puritan authors, all of them strangely named John. John Owen, John Bunyan, Jonathan, everybody's named John. But anyway, this is what I was reading, and I started feeling like I was a deep thinker in comparison with many of my friends at the Bible college who were evangelicals and were modern. Most of my friends thought that they were going deep in history if they ever read anything by someone who was dead, someone who wasn't alive at the time. Most of the people we read were maybe one generation back, maybe two. That was about it. And here I was reading the Reformers. Here I was reading the Puritans. And here I was living in a place where the snow was falling and there was this darkness in the winter. And I was entering this world of my imagination that I was a Puritan, okay? And I was feeling like a deep guy.
It's so funny. As you're mentioning this, I happen to have on my shelf. I remember too. We talked about this a little bit in my story about thinking that you're deep in history. When I was in 1988 for my birthday, my parents got me this. It's the oldest book that I had ever physically held, right? This thing was originally gifted from somebody to somebody else in like 1926. And then you got the passage where it says, my parents dedicated it and inscribed it to me. It was the oldest book I had ever held, right? This book itself is like over 100 years old. But it was also the oldest book that I ever read in terms of like the written longest ago. And I thought, man, I have dug into the well of what it means to be part of the ancient Christian faith. Like I felt like I had gone back to the beginning.
What is the book? Because I couldn't see.
It's Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah, I couldn't see it on your video. It's too small. Oh yeah, Pilgrim's Progress. You read that. You read that and you feel like you've gone back to the beginning.
I've gone all the way back to the beginning.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay, and for a time, you're going to crack up at this. In fact, you can start cracking up in advance. No, for a time, I even dragged Tina to this very small church outside Grand Rapids that was a strict Baptist church. Okay, the strict Baptists, you've got the Baptists, and you got a lot of varieties. And then you have the Calvinist Baptists, the Reformed Baptists that are strong Calvinistic Baptists, and they're really into history. And then you have the strict Baptists who are like the most radical out there on the edge, okay? And we went to this little church, and I remember it was in the winter still, so snow was everywhere. You go inside this little church, and all I can say is that, have you ever read Moby Dick?
Yes, it's been a while.
Okay, Do you remember that near the beginning of Moby Dick, there's this scene where he goes into a church and this whaler pastor like climbs these ropes up into the pulpit, and he stands there and it's, I just imagine Moby Dick, imagine New England back then, imagine everything is wood and the pastor's got this giant gnarly beard and he literally climbs ropes, up into the pulpit and he preaches. And all of his illustrations are about whaling and spears and harpoons and everything because his congregation are made up of whalers, That's what I felt like in this strict Baptist church. I felt like I have literally gone back to the church that John Bunyan would have been pastoring. And the guy, in fact, that was the pastor, I remember, I was told that he had just been like the town butcher for like 25 years. And when the pastor of the church died, everybody elevated him to the pastorate because he was the most holy man and that kind of thing. And I remember how he scared the heck out of me too, because Tina and I are in the congregation the first time and there's only like 15 people there. And so we stand out and he comes up to me after the service and he looks at me with these like searing eyes, and I'm this young guy, I'm like 23 or 24 years old sitting there and he goes, "My son, do you know the grace of God?" It's one of those. It's
oh man!
But it's like he was saying to me, "I can tell that you may not be regenerated. You may not know the grace. You may not belong
smell the
to Christ."
sin on you.
Yeah, and he's looking into my eyes to discover this, and I felt like, no, I've never been converted. I'm not a no. I didn't say that, but anyway, this was the kind of world I was living in. Okay, I was in love, really in love with the whole idea of being the serious Calvinist Baptist like John Bunyan, in the mold of the 16th century Baptists in England. Okay. What did I think about the church of the first 15 centuries? Not much.
I was about to say, like I say, you're probably like me. You're reading Pilgrim's Progress and thinking this is the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that the church before that is Catholicism, and Catholicism. Well, I knew that was wrong. I mean, I knew it was wrong. What in particular did I think of Catholicism? I thought of Catholicism like the Puritans did. And if you've read the Puritans, you know what they thought of Catholicism. The Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon. It was this false, degraded, distorted version of Christianity that had arisen in the early centuries and had conquered the world and had remained there as really the only form of Christianity for 1,500 years. Let me give you an illustration of what the Puritans thought of Catholicism, Matt. In one of Jonathan Edwards' writings, his book on religious affections, which in many ways is a fantastic book, Jonathan Edwards is describing false humility. And he's talking about what false humility is, what it's comprised of, what it's like. And he uses the Pope for his illustration. And so here's Jonathan Edwards. This is a passage that I would read and I would rejoice in. Quoting Jonathan Edwards, "It seems to be the nature of spiritual pride to make men conceited and ostentatious in their humility. This appears, or this can be illustrated, in that firstborn of pride among the children of men, he who would be called his holiness, even the man of sin, who exalts himself above all that is called God or is worshipped. He styles himself servant of servants, and to make a show of humility, he washes the feet of a number of poor men at his inauguration." Okay?
Wow.
You got it?
It's funny. Yeah, I remember that one. Well, I don't remember that one, but the one I remember from Bunyan, and I looked it up here, where he's going through and he sees this cave where there's two giants, Pope and Pagan. They dwelt in old time, by whose power and tyranny the men whose bones, blood, and ashes lay there, they were cruelly put to death. Pagan has been dead many a day, and Pope, though he yet be alive, he is by reason of age and also of the many shrewd brushes that he met with in his younger days, now so crazy and stiff in his joints that he can now do little more than sit in his cave's mouth.
Yikes. Well, it's amazing that you thought that. It's amazing
that's what
you thought
Pilgrim's
that.
Progress says about the Pope.
That's amazing you thought that up because you didn't know I was going to mention John Bunyan. That's great. That quotation is pretty wild. Yeah, yeah. Well, you know what? Here's the question, and it's been so many years now that it's hard for me to answer it truly. I don't know if I can, but did I believe what Jonathan Edwards believed and John Bunyan about the Catholic Church? I mean, I would say yes, because I adored them, and I basically took their worldview and put it on like a multicolored robe, Joseph. So I would say yes, but it wasn't because I had a deep knowledge of Catholicism truly and had truly come to that opinion. It was more like just a part of the shtick. It was a part of the whole role of being a Puritan and what you accept. And these guys were so smart.
That was certainly how I came to this stuff. It wasn't that I had formed these opinions. I'm like, I too have studied the Roman Catholic Church, and I think exactly what these guys think about it. No, I was like, if Bunyan thinks it's bad, it must be bad. I guess there's no need to explore it any further. Yeah. Just like I wouldn't explore the philosophies of Mr. Worldly Wise Man any further, right? I just trust that he's a bad guy, right?
Yeah, and in a way, I mean, a subject we're going to come to in a few weeks probably, but it was the same thing with Sola Scriptura, I didn't say to myself back then, is Sola Scriptura true? I think I'll do an in-depth theological, exegetical, historical study of Sola Scriptura and decide whether it's true, and then I'll set it as my foundation, Instead, it was just the worldview that I lived in, and everybody smart around me and every Christian I knew believed. This is sort of the same thing. I think I inherited my feeling about Catholicism just from the people I read, and I said, okay, they feel that way, I feel that way. Okay, 1981, I graduate from Grace Bible College. And I aced it again. I
have my second birthday. Yeah. I mean,
I aced it again. At the graduation ceremony, I won the award that they give to someone for the highest achievement in biblical studies and theology and all that. I have this big Greek New Testament that they gave me then, and still have it in my shelf. And Tina and I moved back to California because I had enrolled to study theology at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Okay? Now, I didn't know why I was going to Fuller exactly. I wasn't being sent there by a denomination that was preparing me for the ministry or anything like that. I just loved the study, and I kind of figured I'm going to end up being a pastor or a teacher or a professor or something like that, and I want to deepen my studies. And so we wanted to go to Fuller, because it was a very well-known school, but also it was close to our families. My mother lived alone at the time. Tina's mother lived alone, and we just didn't want to be all the way across the world from them forever. Okay, so we moved back to California, and I'm going to Fuller Theological Seminary, and as you know, Fuller is a international seminary, and it's an interdenominational seminary. So when you go to Fuller Seminary, you're going into a hotbed of ideas, various ideas. I'm sitting in my classes now with Baptists and Presbyterians and Nazarenes and Pentecostals and Anglicans and Lutherans and all sorts of people from various Christian traditions, and students from all over the world, African students, European students. So there are a lot of ideas that are floating around the campus and floating around the classroom. And I'll just say at this point that my mind began to expand a bit beyond where I had been at first as an evangelical in a totally dispensational kind of situation, which I won't define now and I'll come back to later. And then I had become this Puritan kind of guy, a Reformed Baptist, a Calvinistic Baptist. And I remained that, but at Fuller I began to be exposed to a lot more, okay, various schools of theology and all that. My first year at Fuller Seminary, I took some courses from a particular professor that I liked a lot and that I grew to really love. In fact, I became his teaching assistant, and for at least a year, I was like his main man. If he was Zorro, if he was the Lone Ranger, I was going to say if he was Zorro, I was Tonto. That doesn't work. If he was the Lone Ranger.
If you were Zorro, he was the sword. No, wait.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, if he was the Lone Ranger, I was
All
Tonto.
Analogies limp, Ken, as you're so fond of telling me.
Especially ones that you haven't thought through before you say them. Okay, so anyway, he was right out of central casting for a professor. He was sort of absent-minded. He was an oddball, but he had earned PhDs in both Old Testament and New. His New Testament, he had studied with Oscar Kuhlmann in Europe, one of the most famous, world-renowned New Testament scholars at the time. And he was a professor of New Testament exegesis and hermeneutics, the study of interpretation, the art, the science of interpretation. And I took a few classes with him. And as I said, I grew to really, really love him. And, I got to tell this one. You know what? This 5-week series, maybe 10. I'm sorry to tell you, but this guy was just straight. And he was talking about C.S. Lewis one day, and he was praising C.S. Lewis for something C.S. Lewis had said. And he was going on and on. So anyway, I'm this student, and I'm wanting to kiss up to my professor. So a couple of days later in class, some subject comes up, and I go, oh, well, C.S. Lewis said, blah. I start, like bringing Lewis into the thing. Reminds me of that episode of The Office when Michael Scott, there's a new fellow in the office, a black employee in the office, and he walks up to him and starts saying, my Denzel Washington's my favorite, my favorite actor.
You're right.
I'm sure you'd say. Anyway, I start praising C.S. Lewis, and this professor looks at me and he goes, once in a great while, something C.S. Lewis says will intersect with the theology of the Bible. Just nails me.
Devastating.
He just devastates me. But anyway, here's what happened in his class. And I'm going to come back to this when we talk about justification by faith alone later. But he's in class one day, and he's totally a Protestant. But he begins to talk about Luther and Calvin, and he just like he nailed C.S. Lewis that day, he just jumps up and he says, Luther and Calvin didn't know what they were talking about. He just starts putting them down. And he says, this idea that we are justified by faith alone, this idea that the moment you look to the cross of Christ in faith, that Christ's righteousness is legally credited to your account and you are justified, done deal, past tense, you are saved. He says, this doesn't match the pattern that we see in the Bible at all. He said, throughout the Bible, from the very beginning, he's the one who said this to me, that you and I have talked about at length in our series on Sola Fide. He says, if you read the stories of the Bible, he goes, the entire Bible is nothing more than the stories of men and women and their relationships with God. Never do you see this pattern of believe, and then you receive the blessing. Believe and you receive the blessing by faith alone, and then you go on to be obedient, out of gratitude to God or whatever, Instead, he said, the pattern you see throughout the entire Bible is that people are called to trust God and do what he says, faith and obedience, and persevere in faith and obedience, and then they receive the blessing at the end of that path of perseverance. And so he just brought this up, and he started giving illustrations from the Bible and all. And the only point I want to make at this juncture, Matt, because we'll be coming back to this later, is that I came to believe over time that he was right, and I began to kind of become rattled about the Reformation issue of justification. And when I left seminary and I went on, to become a pastor in many years, and I was preaching a view of these things that, looking back, I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I can see was more Catholic than it was Protestant. But that didn't cross my mind. I never once said to myself, oh my, I'm teaching a Catholic view. I mean, in bottom line essentials, I'm teaching an essentially Catholic view of the path of salvation. Faith.
You would have thought I'm teaching an essentially biblical view of salvation.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is the same. And I just thought it's the same thing, right? The biblical view is the Catholic view. I would encourage people, by the way, if they want to get to the lengthier discussion of how this question played out, especially for you. I didn't wrestle with it as much because I didn't come from the Lutheran Calvin camps. But we did a whole series of episodes. They're called A Damning System of Works Righteousness. And you can find all kinds of, all the faith alone talk you could possibly want to jam into your head.
Just to help people, it begins with episode 17 of On the Journey with Matt and Ken. And it's a series that goes on 14, 15 18, I don't know, episodes.
Interminable. It's interminable, Ken.
Okay, but see, here was, and again, I only saw this really looking backward after I became Catholic, but this was the doctrine that had shook the church to its foundations. This was the doctrine that Martin Luther said, that his doctrine of justification was the doctrine upon which the church stands or falls. He's the one who said, anyone who does not accept my doctrine cannot be saved. John Calvin had said that this doctrine of justification by faith alone was the hinge upon which the door of all true religion swings. And all of a sudden, I'm in seminary. I'm in a Protestant seminary, and I've got a Protestant professor, again, with 2 earned PhDs, Old Testament and New Testament, who's kind of taking that cage and shaking it a little bit. But you're dead right. I came away just thinking, no, I've refined my view. I'm holding a more biblical view of what it means to be saved. And since, at least theoretically, as a Protestant, aren't I free to follow the Bible? And nothing's sacrosanct, right? I mean, nothing is infallible. Luther and Calvin are not infallible. And so I went on preaching a view that was in some ways Catholic without ever knowing it, okay? And that's what happened. Now, I'm looking at the clock, Matt, and I think that this is a good time to kind of like press the pause button.
Get a cliffhanger in?
Well,
do we
because
get a cliffhanger though?
Okay, I'll create one on the spot, and therefore it will limp just like my illustration.
Your analogies.
But I graduated from Fuller Theological Seminary with my master's degree in theology, and I enrolled in a doctoral program at Claremont Graduate School in Southern California. And I'll make this the cliffhanger. This has popped into my mind, okay? Something strange happened when I was at Fuller. I was sitting in an exegesis course on 1 John, the Greek text of 1 John. It was a small class, maybe 10 people in the class. I remember distinctly, I was looking down at my notes when all of a sudden I heard a voice that I didn't recognize in the room. And I heard this voice ask the professor a really smart question, okay? And I remember just thinking, that was a smart question. And I looked over and I saw this young man in the class that I had never met before. At the end of the class, the professor calls me up to his podium, and he calls this fellow up too. And he says, Ken, I'd like you to meet Scott Hahn. He's out here. He's considering doing doctoral work, possibly at Fuller. He might be working with me. Since I was his teaching assistant, I wonder if you would be his host while he's out here. Scott was going to spend a couple of weeks talking to professors, thinking about the school and all that. So anyway, I met this young, skinny guy who was just finishing up his work at Gordon Conwell.
Calvinist hothead too, right?
He was a total Calvinist Presbyterian. And here's the thing. He was in love with biblical theology. That was his sort of field. I was in love with biblical theology. That was my field. He and I were reading some of the same books and had the same kind of interests. And so he and I, you know how it is when you're 23, when you're 25, 26 years old, he and I ran around together for 2 weeks talking a million miles an hour about the books we were reading and the things we were thinking and all the things we were learning. He was a Calvinist Presbyterian. I was a Calvinist Baptist. And we became good friends in about 2 weeks' time. In fact, when he went back to Pennsylvania, where he was from, he and I stayed in contact for about 2 years, talking on the phone, staying in touch a little bit. And then around 1983, I would say, I lost track of Scott. And I didn't talk to him for another decade. And then he will come back into the story. Is that a cliffhanger?
That's a good cliffhanger. You met Scott, the Calvinist firebrand Hahn, in his Calvinist glory days. You were tossing frisbees with him around the Fuller campus.
Who winds up becoming one of the big conversions to the Catholic faith many years later.
But not anywhere connected with the time that you met him. Not for a long while. So
No.
And we're getting into parts that I do know here, and I'm excited to. I really encourage the listeners. I know, based on where we are in your story, where we're going to just basically have to go next. So next time is going to be a really fun episode. personally, Ken, I love getting into your superhero origin story. It's like how Iron Man became Iron Man in that cave in Afghanistan or whatever, hammering together the first Iron Man suit.
That's it. And of course, it's easy for you because you just like lean back against your bookcase there and give me a hard time if you can think about it.
Sit back and I listen to the Back to the Bible Ambassador Youth Choir, and just think about how great it is to talk to my friend who had his 70s conversion. You've
got the weirdest collection of vinyl I've ever seen.
I think you mean classiest. I think that's the adjective you're looking for.
Classiest. That's a word.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Ken, this is good stuff. I mean, honestly, this is a lot of fun, and it speaks to a completely different kind of experience that I had in my particular story that I told over the course of 5 episodes. I'm really excited again because I know where this is going. But if you want to find out more about some of the doctrines that are in play here and how Ken has sorted through them over the years, I encourage you to check out other episodes of On the Journey. He mentioned that system on Sola Fide. There's another one on Sola Scriptura, and a couple of others that are relevant to this discussion. Go to chnetwork.org and you can find those episodes. Actually, chnetwork.org/onthejourney for all the old episodes. The main site is where you can find all kinds of resources, including lots and lots of stories from various people. But if you want to plug into the community where we're actively having conversations with people who are going through this process and thinking it through right now, and especially if you're one of those people, head on over to community.chnetwork.org. Ken, a pleasure. We'll catch up with you again next week.
Okay, we'll see you, Matt.